The year is 1470, and deep in the mountains of Thessaly, a lone bell tolls for the final time. Its sound drifts across a valley that will never hear it again, dissolving into the cold morning air like a farewell whispered by the earth itself. Inside the convent of St. Catherine, 23 women kneel in tight rows, their hands folded, their lips murmuring prayers they've spoken every dawn for years. But today, the words feel heavier. Their familiar cadence tastes like ash, like the end of something sacred. Outside those ancient stone walls, the horizon glows, a violent bleeding red. It isn't the sunrise painting the sky. It's the approach of an empire whose banners blot out the morning like a bad omen. The Ottoman army doesn't advance so much as consume, pouring over the land in a current of steel, fire, and unstoppable momentum. Villages, monasteries, dynasties, everything disappears beneath it. At the front of the chapel stands Sister Ilani, the abbess, her fingers wrapped around a silver crucifix passed down through 3 generations. Her hands tremble, but there is no fear in them. She knows exactly what awaits her and the women under her care. They all do. What none of them can foresee is that history will try its hardest to bury the state so deeply that no one would ever learn what truly unfolded here, not until centuries later. Because what happened to these 23 women wasn't just another grim footnote of war. It wasn't simply conquest. It was calculated, methodical, and it was meant to leave no trace. But traces have a way of surviving when faith refuses to die. If you've ever wondered why some stories are told endlessly, while others vanish without a whisper, you're about to see how easily history can be edited and how stubborn memory can be when it claws its way back from the dark. The bell has gone silent. Beyond the gates, the first Ottoman ranks appear. And before we watch that final moment erupt, we need to understand the machine that swallowed this convent whole. 17 years earlier, in 1453, Constantinople, once the glittering jewel of the Christian world, fell. A city that had stood for 1,000 years collapsed in just 53 days beneath cannon fire that shook the foundations of its empire. The Hagia Sophia, the grandest cathedral on earth, lost its crosses in mere hours. Its artwork was covered, its bells melted into raw metal. Within days, the Islamic call to prayer echoed under its massive dome, replacing hymns sung for 9 centuries. Sultan Mehmed II stood inside that ancient sanctuary and proclaimed it a mosque. Not because he needed another place to pray. No, he understood something far more strategic. Killing people doesn't end a civilization. Erasing who they were does. For Mehmed, every church bell still ringing in a conquered land was a challenge. Every monastery still standing was a reminder that the old world refused to bow. And every nun whispering Latin prayers was a spark that could reignite resistance. So he made a quiet decision, one history rarely mentions. If they will not convert, they will disappear. Not through slaughter. Slaughter creates martyrs, and martyrs spark rebellion. Songs rise, stories spread, the dead gain voices. But erasure spreads nothing. It ends with silence. By 1470, this tactic had already been perfected. Across Greece, Serbia, Armenia, the same pattern repeated. First came the offer of conversion, spoken gently, almost politely. Then came the quiet enforcement. And when quiet failed, something far darker followed. St. Catherine's convent, perched on the lonely hillside in Thessaly, sat too far from a fortress to be defended and too insignificant for anyone to rescue. To the empire, it was simply another test case. But these women were not test subjects. They were healers, singers, farmers, scholars. Their world was built on prayer, humility, and the rhythm of a life devoted entirely to God. Their hands were made for tending gardens, not wielding blades. Their strength came from silence, not force. Sister Ilani had been abbess for 12 years. She had watched the village she once served vanish in the plague of 1448, and the convent became her refuge, a place to rebuild meaning from the wreckage. Sister Magdalena, only 19, still carried the calluses of farm work,
her family long buried after a raid left her alone in the world. And Sister Theodorus, 70 years old, had survived emperors, wars, and losses too numerous to recount. Death no longer frightened her, but even she had never witnessed what was coming. The lesson of this moment, one paid for with the lives of innocent women, is simple. The most dangerous act in the presence of absolute power is refusing to forget who you are. And now, we watch what happens when faith stands face to face with an empire determined to erase it. The first cannonball strikes just after dawn. It doesn't hit the chapel, it hits the bell tower. Stone erupts, iron screams. The bell that had rung every day for 140 years shatters mid-swing, raining down in molten shards onto the courtyard where herbs once grew under the nuns' careful hands. Those same hands fly to their ears as the blast shakes the earth. But Sister Ilani rises. She lifts her crucifix, and she begins to sing. Kyrie eleison, Lord, have mercy. One by one, the other voices join her, until 23 souls are singing against the thunder of an empire. But empires are deaf to prayer. By midday, the gates fall. Ottoman soldiers flood into the courtyard, not with drawn swords, but with ledgers and inkpots. They move like accountants cataloging assets, because that's all these women are to them. A translator, a Greek man whose voice quivers with guilt, steps forward and reads from a scroll. By order of Sultan Mehmed II, all subjects must submit or face the consequences of rebellion. Sister Ilani steps forward, addressing the translator, not the men behind him. Tell your Sultan we have already given our lives to a king. Hassan Pasha, the officer in charge, a real figure recorded in Ottoman military documents, smiles, not with kindness, with certainty. He knows these women are not meant to survive, not physically, not spiritually. His job is to break them without killing them. What follows is a method so cold, it makes death look merciful. The women are locked in their own chapel. No food, no water, no light. They wait. Two young sisters sob in the corner. Sister Magdalena whispers psalms until the crying subsides. The Ottomans think they're applying pressure, but these women have trained their whole lives for suffering, through fasts, vigils, silence. Faith is what they breathe. Hassan Pasha watches from the courtyard, measuring not their faith, but their limits. On the second day, food arrives. Bread and water, clean and tempting. A trick meant to soften them through gratitude. Ilani orders a fast. On the third day, their lips split, their legs shake, but they do not break. Hassan enters, calm, almost friendly. You are not criminals, he says through the translator. You are mistaken. Convert and you will live new lives under the Sultan's protection, or travel to Constantinople for judgment. The journey is long. The weak do not survive it. It is not a threat. It is a guarantee. Ilani sees her sisters, pale, dehydrated, hollow-eyed, and answers for all of them. We will walk. Hassan smiles. Again. Dawn approaches, and the road to Constantinople waits.
The fourth morning begins with ropes binding their wrists and dust rising beneath their feet. 23 nuns begin the long march south toward the coast. No horses, no carts. Only the shuffle of sandaled feet and the watchful eyes of soldiers who don't need to hurry. The road itself is punishment enough. By the second day, Sister Irene collapses. 62, her joints ruined by years of kneeling in prayer, she tries to stand. Her legs buckle. The soldiers do not pause. They have no reason to. But Sister Magdalena does. She lifts the older woman's weight onto her small shoulders, joined by Sister Anna. Together, they carry Irene 3 agonizing miles. That night, Irene's body fails. She dies silently, in the dark. The sisters bury her with their bare hands. No tools, no rites. Only whispered prayers carried off by the wind. Hassan Pasha notes the death in his ledger without expression. 22 remaining. 2 days later, another sister stops. Galista, who had not spoken since the siege, simply sits in the road, folds her hands, and closes her eyes. They leave her behind. By the time they reach the port of Volos a week later, only 18 remained. Their bodies are failing, but their spirits are no longer fragile. Something unexpected has taken root in them. They walk not with fear, but with a quiet resolve that alarms their captors. The Ottomans had expected tears, pleas, bargains. Instead, they get silence. A silence that feels like defiance. On the 7th morning, Hassan Pasha summons Sister Alani to his tent. She goes willingly. What happens inside is lost to official records, but the aftermath is not. A Venetian merchant later wrote of what he witnessed at dawn. They carried her out dressed in silk, calling her a convert. But her eyes were empty, and yet her lips still moved, praying in Latin. The Ottomans had broken her body, her mind, but they could not touch the part of her that mattered. She returned to the line, silent, hollow, present in form only. Her sisters wept, the older ones prayed louder. She was alive, but she was gone. On the 12th day, the remaining women are chained inside a war galley, not passengers, cargo. Iron cuffs bind their wrists to wooden benches. The manifest, discovered centuries later, doesn't bother naming them. It lists them only as religious captives, female, 18. Destination, imperial household. Purpose, domestic service and conversion. Purpose, a word stretched thin enough to hide anything. The voyage is a trial of misery, storms, sickness, hunger. The constant sway of the sea. The nuns vomit until their bodies empty themselves of everything but prayer. At night, Sister Magdalena whispers psalms into the darkness. Her voice is weak, but prisoners chained nearby lean closer, letting her words carry them through the black hours. When the ship glides into the Bosporus at dawn, the skyline of Constantinople rises like a promise and a threat. Domes and towers gleam in the first light. The city looks eternal, invincible. But for these women, it is a cage, waiting to close. They march through crowded streets as merchants pause mid-transaction, soldiers stare, and slaves look on with hollow understanding. Christian nuns as captives, this is no ordinary sight. They are forced to kneel in the shadow of the Hagia Sophia. The call to prayer rings out from its minarets, and one of the sisters whispers, "We are home," but it is no longer ours. From there, they are led past gardens, fountains, soaring arches, and guarded gates, deeper and deeper into the imperial complex, but not into its grand halls. Downward, always downward. Stone steps spiral into the earth. The air grows damp. The walls close in, and soon the sunlight vanishes entirely. They reach a place that does not appear on palace maps, a place meant not for the world above, but for what the world must never see. Years later, during restoration in 2011, archaeologists would uncover this very chamber. Behind a false wall, they would find crude crosses scratched into the stone, hundreds of them. And beneath those crosses, a Latin phrase carved by hands that refused to surrender. Lux in tenebris locet. The light shines in the darkness. But for now, the nuns do not know this room will be their only sanctuary. They do not know how long they will last. They do not know who among them will fail or disappear first. All they know is the darkness swallowing them, the chains closing behind them, and the echo of their own breathing as the last sliver of light fades. And yet, somewhere in that suffocating silence, a spark remains. Because what these women are about to do in the depths of this palace will outlive the empire that tried to erase them.
Beneath the glittering courtyards of Topkapi Palace, where sultans ruled, ambassadors negotiated, and eunuchs whispered secrets, there existed another world. A world few ever imagined, and even fewer survived. The Sisters of St. Catherine were taken into that underworld on their first night in Constantinople. Down narrow, spiraling staircases, through tunnels carved by forgotten hands, past storerooms filled with dust-covered jars and corridors that smelled faintly of damp stone, rusted iron, and time. And finally, into a chamber with no windows, no altar, no signs of life, just darkness waiting to swallow them whole. This place was not meant for prisoners, nor for servants. It wasn't meant for anything at all, at least not officially. Ottoman records are silent about rooms like this. Yet every empire has its shadows, and the sisters had been cast directly into one of them. By day, they were worked like ghosts. They cleaned the palace kitchens, scrubbed soot from torches, carried water through endless passages, washed linens that would touch the skin of nobles who never knew they existed. They moved silently, heads down, wrists raw from labor. But when night fell and the palace finally slept, when even the guards grew tired and the oil lamps dimmed, they slipped away. There, behind a wall of ancient stone, was their refuge, a cramped, forgotten chamber carved into the bedrock. This would become their hidden chapel. Long after the empire that buried them had turned to dust, archaeologists would discover this room. They would find crosses, hundreds of them, etched into the stone, some tiny and faint, others carved with such force that the marks cut deep into the rock. And beneath them, those 4 Latin words, lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. But on the night the sisters first gathered there, it was empty, bare, cold, a void waiting for voices. Sister Magdalena was the first to kneel. Her body still ached from the journey, and her wrists were raw from the chains of the galley. But she closed her eyes and whispered the prayer they had sung on their last morning in Thessaly, Kyrie eleison. Another voice joined her, then another, until the chamber filled with a soft, trembling chorus, a sound so fragile it felt like it might shatter in the air. These women had no priest, no scripture, no bread or wine. Their faith had been stripped to its bones. And yet, here in the most forgotten room of the empire's heart, they rebuilt their sanctuary from memory. They fashioned candle holders out of broken pottery, they tore linen from cast-off scraps in the laundry and folded it into a makeshift altar cloth. From a shard of a shattered mirror, they shaped a crude cross. And when they ran out of tools, they carved crosses into the wall with their fingernails until their hands bled. Every night they returned. Every night they prayed. Sometimes in Latin, sometimes in Greek, sometimes in silence. And slowly, this underground tomb became a place of fierce hope. One by one, they shared memories, rituals they feared would disappear forever if not spoken aloud. Sister Theodorus described the sound of the bell tower before it fell. Sister Anna recalled the scent of fresh bread rising in the convent kitchen. Sister Petra remembered the feeling of morning sunlight filtering through the chapel windows. These small moments, ordinary, sacred, became their new scripture. In the dark, their lost lives were resurrected. But beneath the palace, nothing stayed hidden forever. On some nights, they heard footsteps above them, snatches of laughter, shouts, orders, and beneath those, other sounds, groans, whimpers, the echoes of others who had been buried in this underworld long before them. Their days blurred together. Some sisters began to fade quietly, slowly, as if each passing sunrise stole another layer from their souls. Others held on with fierce determination. But one woman became the heart of their endurance, Sister Magdalena. Barely 19, she had marched across mountains, endured torture, whispered psalms to keep the others alive, and she still returned every night to carve lines into the wall. 23 lines, one for each sister, but only 11 of those lines would ever be completed. She carved until her hands shook and her fingers blistered. She carved when she could barely stand. She carved when food was scarce, when punishment loomed, when hope flickered like a dying flame. And beside those lines, she etched a small bird, the same symbol she had drawn as a child on her parents' farm, a bird that meant freedom. The sisters prayed beside that bird, their fingers brushing the rough stone, imagining wings in a place where no creature could fly. Then, one winter night, the singing stopped. The crosses on the wall ended abruptly. The carvings grew frantic, deeper, more desperate, as if someone had carved them not with patience, but with terror. Then nothing. Silence. And the records of the palace, those neat, merciless ledgers, contained just a single line: staff reduction. Non-compliant personnel removed. Removed. Not buried, not sentenced, not relocated. Erased. No names, no details, no trace. The sisters disappeared from history that night. But what they carved remained. What they whispered lingered in the stone. What they endured became a quiet rebellion the empire could not fully silence. 3 centuries later, in 1712, a French diplomat passing through the palace wrote of eerie sounds at night, Latin hymns carried on drafts of cooled air. Palace servants believed the voices belonged to the women who had died below. He dismissed it as superstition, but the walls he walked above were telling the truth. The archaeologists who broke through the false wall in 2011 were expecting a storage room, maybe old tools, at most, forgotten pottery. They did not expect to find an entire chapel carved by hand. Cross after cross after cross. Scratches so deep that they must have taken weeks, months, years. Traces of wax on the floor, not from Ottoman lamps, but from convent-style candles mixed with herbs. Unique, ancient, unmistakable. The nuns had continued their vigil far longer than anyone thought possible. One archaeologist later said, "It felt like stepping into a prayer trapped in stone." And on the farthest corner of the chamber, beneath the bird carved by a young girl who refused to break, they found a final message scratched in Greek, barely visible. We endure. Not we endured, as in past tense. Not we survived, as in triumph. We endure. A declaration, a warning, a promise. Because in their darkest hour, buried beneath an empire, they believed the world would one day hear them. And now, centuries later, you just did.
For 600 years, the Ottoman Empire reshaped continents. Its armies marched from Vienna to Arabia. Its rulers commanded wealth, power, and influence that defined eras. It controlled the crossroads of the world. But in the end, what survived wasn't a decree, a battle, or a king. It was a handful of crosses, carved by women no one was meant to remember. Think about that. An empire with cannons, armies, and architects of conquest, undone not by rebellion or overthrow, but by scratches in a wall hidden under its own palace. History is often told by the powerful, but memory belongs to those who refuse to be erased. The story of the Sisters of St. Catherine isn't about religion. It isn't about Christian versus Muslim, nor empire versus convent. It's about something more universal. What happens when power tries to erase people? And what happens when those people refuse to disappear? These women had nothing. No weapons, no names in the records, no graves, no voices. But they had one thing empires never truly understand: a will that cannot be conquered. They lost their convent. They lost their home. Many lost their sanity, their health, even their own identities. But they did not lose themselves. Not where it mattered. They carved their prayers into stone because they knew stone could outlast lies. They whispered hymns into the dark because they believed someone, someday, would listen.
They stretched the bird into the wall as a promise that even in the deepest pit, a soul can still try to fly. And they carved those 4 words, Lux in tenebres lucet, because they understood a truth that outlives empires. Light doesn't stop being light just because darkness surrounds it. When the archaeologists unearthed the chapel in 2011, they stood silently for minutes before anyone spoke. One of them later asked, "How long did they stay alive down here?" The wax traces suggested years. The depth of certain carvings suggested repeated visits night after night. The abrupt halt of the crosses suggested a sudden, devastating end. The sisters had clung to life with a resilience that defied every intention of their captors. Even as one disappeared, even as another went silent, even as their numbers dwindled, they prayed, they carved, they endured. Faith to them wasn't a shield. Faith was rebellion. And then history turned. Empires fell. Sultans became dust. The palace became a museum. Tourists walked halls once reserved for kings. But below their feet, buried beneath centuries of stone and silence, the sisters remained. Crosses, wax, scratches, a bird, a phrase. Proof that they lived. Proof that they resisted. Proof that they refused to be erased. The Ottoman Empire's rule ended in 1922. Its armies dissolved, its banners faded, its palaces turned into relics. But the marks on that hidden chamber wall are still there. And the words haven't faded. Lux in tenebres lucet. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. It's a verse from the Gospel of John, a reminder that truth survives even when everything else is taken from you. Sister Magdalena carved those words knowing the world would move on without her, knowing she would never see daylight again, knowing no one would speak her name for centuries. But she carved them anyway, because she believed that someday, someone would find them. And you just did. You looked backward and found their forward path. You heard voices that were never meant to survive. You remembered women who refused to let silence define them. The empire that tried to erase them is gone. But they endure. In stone, in memory, in every story reclaimed from the dark. And now, because you've heard their voices, they will not disappear again. Lux in tenebres lucet. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it.